Hello, this is UKRLIFE with Ludmila Nemyria, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And we are very happy that our guest today is Gustav Gressel. He is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And before his academic career, he served 5 years in the Austrian Armed Forces. And from 2006 till 2014, he worked at the Austrian Ministry of Defense. Mr. Gressel, hello, thank you so much to be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Mr. Gressel, back in early February 2024, you predict that this year would be the most difficult time for Ukraine since the first 2 months of the full-scale invasion. And today we have a September. How the situation looks like today?
Well, unfortunately, quite as predicted. So, U.S. military assistance was unfortunately very late. I think in February we had little idea how late it became, and that, of course, had further on consequences down the road. Ukraine had quite high losses in men and material during this time, and it was hard to kind of rebound from it. Now we still have an uncertain situation. Of course, the uncertainty has been pushed towards the US election. Nobody knows exactly what the two presidents will be up to. I have a slightly more optimistic view on Harris than I had on Biden. Both in terms of the chance they might be elected president and as well as future Ukraine policy. The Biden administration, despite of the rhetorical difference in substance, might not be all too far away from what some of the MAGA crowd is pronouncing. And yeah, in that case, it is really hard to predict, of course, the situation for next year. But of course, why it is the most difficult year for Ukraine, because also on the Russian side, we have now a quite unique strength that I don't think will continue into the future, where sort of on the same level at least. Russians have now ample of equipment. Their defense industry is geared up. They're renovating their stuff from Soviet stocks at a really high pace, but of course, they're achieving this really high pace by picking the best main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and other vehicles they can find in their storage. The repair and restoration time is getting longer the more they push down the road. And with some parts of equipment, they actually face quite some shortages. And I'm not really sure how much North Korea and Iran can fully plug them. So they are now kind of in their best capability to do harm to Ukraine. But next year, especially at the end of next year and then towards 2026, this capability will increase. And after 2026, it might decrease quite rapidly, and we might see Russia either trying to get the way out of the war or to significantly scale down its military operations. So I'll have to wait for that. But this is why this year is extremely difficult. There's uncertainty in the military supply, and there is a Russian military apparatus that is unfortunately as more capable as it has ever been. So yeah, bad situation.
You predicted in your article, you predicted 3 scenarios for Russia's war against Ukraine, but you make a prediction at the beginning of this year, when the candidates for president of USA is not understandable, and we know that everything changed right now. Mm-hmm. And if you try to rewrite your article right now, what this 3 scenario could be, how it looks like,
Yeah. So roughly, we are still in the middle ground scenario. So the US supply has rebounded. There was basically a compromise found, although very lately. European supplies are shockingly low compared to what they planned and promised at the beginning of the year. So that is certainly a minus compared to what is possible. But the problem is that the US election and the future of US policy looms larger as the kind of Damocles sword than it was foreseeable at the beginning of this year. I thought that at least some Europeans will start a discussion on what to do if Trump wins, and would we then sort of deliver Ukraine to the full mercy of the US president? And if you lead that discussion, that's not a policy discussion you can kind of do in a workshop and then you go out and you decide the one or the other way. If you would really want to prepare for such a scenario where Europe would need to support and supply Ukraine on its own, you would need actually 2 years preparation time, but at least 1 year. Because this requires defense industrial capabilities that Europe simply doesn't have. And if you want to acquire them, you either need to invest in your industry, or you need to conclude Trump-proof long-term delivery contracts with the United States in order to substitute US financing for the very same products, and at the same time have a guarantee to be delivered these products beforehand, before Trump could leverage his okay for other concessions that Europeans probably won't make. So on that, nothing has happened. Absolutely nothing has happened. On the contrary, we see Germany axing its military support to Ukraine. We see France not having a government. We see Britain, although now having a government, they lack the finances to do anything about it. And basically the rest of the Europeans is more or less a bystander waiting for the Americans. So the whole idea that could have become a topic during this year, that Europe would be prepared, is out of the window. And in that sense, sort of the middle ground scenario towards the end, that US elections, the presidential and the legislative elections, will be decisive for the war effort, holds more true than ever, and all other alternative causes are to be dismissed, because we neither have the capability now, nor the will, nor now the time to do anything else. And that is, of course, very unfortunate.
You say that you is more optimistic about the Kamala than about the Biden. Why you say so?
So Kamala will change some people in the foreign policy apparatus, and I'm of course particularly curious here on her picks in the National Security Council. Now, I don't say that all the people she will pick will be totally different than the people that were there before, but it's at least a chance that it might be different. The other thing is, of course, that her vice president is quite outspoken on what he wants, and it's always good to have an outspoken vice president. There are usually some portfolios that a vice president can claim for itself and where it can insert itself, and if that were Ukraine, it would be a benefit. Now, I'm not saying that it's my prediction is gonna get this way, but at least there is a chance that it might go down this road. So on Biden himself, well, first, the prospect of a Biden-Trump rerun, an exact repetition of the last presidential election, is the most uninspiring thing in American domestic politics. So I guess it would have left a lot of voters staying home, and hence made the election even more risky for the Democratic side. The second thing is, I always had some second thoughts about Biden. I mean, yes, I have to credit him that without him, Ukraine would not exist today. American support has been crucial to keeping Ukraine alive. But regarding the second thoughts, of course, I also see that Biden has no strategy for the war, and he has tuned down the military support, or at least he has derogated all aims in the war to the premises of being absolutely safe against the Russian escalation, which is, first of all, an unachievable goal, and second, a goal that really infringes with any sort of war strategy. And on the second thoughts, well, I think the recent Washington Post article on the failed partial ceasefire, sort of an initiative, of course, initiated by the US, that Ukraine would not strike at Russian oil refineries, but Russia would not strike at Ukraine's energy grid, gives a hint on where the Biden administration and Biden himself is actually thinking at and actually going towards. Because the article hints also that they thought that this would be the kind of breaking ground for initiating negotiations towards the general ceasefire. On which terms? There's nothing there about territory, but there's also, and here Biden is actually quite explicit about that, nothing about Ukraine's future. Biden explicitly said Ukraine will not become a NATO member. NATO membership is the most credible guarantee for Russia to not restart the war once it has regunned, rearmed, and reformed its armed forces so it can do so better. A Ukraine that is just in a frozen conflict where you have an imposed ceasefire with no political framework for Ukraine to secure that it will not be the victim of a second attack is just catastrophic. It will be catastrophic even without Russia attacking, because everybody would expect Russia to attack in a couple of years. And in such a climate, nobody will invest its private money in Ukraine, neither European investor nor an American nor Ukrainian investor. Ukrainians would, those who have fled abroad would stay abroad because they don't think that returning home is a good option. And those who have not fled will try to get the money they make to carry it abroad in order to have a safety net in the case of renewed Russian offensive. So you will have a demographically depleted Ukraine, a financially depleted Ukraine, a Ukraine that is in an economic stalemate and where nobody wants to go. You will basically have a Moldovanization of Ukraine, if you may express it like that. And in that, basically, yeah, the Russians might try again. There might be domestic turmoil. It's just there's no good outcome from there to work with. And on that, I have to say, if that was what the Biden administration was aiming for, they're not all too different from what Donald Trump is aiming at. Now, Donald Trump might be more blunt and brutal in his language, but the substance is fairly similar. And then, of course, I understand many Ukrainians who say that, well, but Trump is so erratic, and in his erratic nature, you have a chance in changing his mind, whereas Biden is like an oil tanker. There is no chance for any small boat to make this oil tanker change his mind and get him rethink his preferences and policies. And that, yeah, so actually now we have a chance of having a better US policy on Ukraine, a more stringent one, and I hope it will materialize. Unfortunately, again, Europeans failed completely to prepare for the contingency, and unfortunately, the consequences will also be upon us.
Let's speak about the strategy. You say that today West have no strategy for this war. And I asked different experts from different countries, especially from USA, for example, Samuel Sharp. I asked him, does America have any strategy? And he said, I don't know this strategy. Nobody knows. And in that case, you say about the frozen conflicts. Frozen conflicts is a very understandable situation all over the world. And everybody thinks, oh, if we cannot do something and we have the end of the process, just leave it as it is, just frozen conflict. But now I think it is not a decision of the problem, and you quite brilliant explain why right now, yeah, for Ukraine, for example. That is why. Why do you think there is a big problem with this strategy? Does it mean that it needs to change the whole role of Russia all over the world, the role of Russia in, in security of the world, in security of the Europe? And do you think that it is question of nearest future to rethink many, many things, or it is a question of a far future, which is quite problematic for Ukraine?
Well, it's not my choice what European politicians are doing and what the Americans doing. I can roughly give you an explanation into what I think is Biden's and Scholz's mind. So, first of all, they're afraid of nuclear escalation, and they have personally Biden more, but Scholz nil personal experience with nuclear deterrence and crisis. Biden hasn't really managed a political crisis with another nuclear power. I think the last president that had was George W. Bush when the Chinese shot down an American plane in the South China Sea in the summer, I think, of 2001. But in this void in between, there had not been a deep political crisis between really established and nuclear powers that are capable of making a second strike. I discount now North Korea and Iran as yeah, they are nuclear powers, or Israel, they are nuclear powers, but clearly secondary nuclear powers, as are Pakistan and India. And of course, the current war is something far more disturbing and deeper and brutal than a Chinese shooting down an American spy plane. So they're insecure. Then they have, this is of course especially a thing with Germany, but also a thing to a large extent in the US, that they are perceiving Russia as a huge, invincible, gigantic, never-ending source of mass and military might. You can't win against Russia. That's basically said in Berlin, all over the place, and there are a lot of people that are saying the very same thing in Washington. That, of course, leaves apart sizable portions of Russian history where they have indeed lost wars, even have lost wars against minor powers, such as Japan, which was considerably smaller than the Russian Empire during the Russo-Japanese War, and was just technologically advanced and militarily better prepared. It also completely ignores Russia's fate in the First World War, where Russia also lost, but never mind. And in this, they're kind of seeking out for some way to muddle through, where they, on the one hand, don't want Ukraine to be fully conquered and erased, because that would give horrible press stories of the Russian genocide, and domestic audience would point the fingers towards them. But on the other hand, they have no clue about how Ukraine should win or could win, or what it should do to prevail in this. And hence you have a mixture of short-term measures attempted to keep Ukraine afloat, but no real thinking about how this all could end. And the kind of default option then is, and this was already during the Minsk period, is, yeah, the best thing is if there's no war. Disregarding that a bad truce or a bad peace is just the prelude to war, as was the Munich Accord. Munich Accord was peace, of course, but for not even 1 year. This might be Minsk was not even peace, but scaled down war, but just for a couple of years, for 8 years, and for 9 years for the Minsk I agreement. So it's not a solution, but people perceive it as a solution. And then kind of the same paradigms that already were there under the Minsk debate come up, like, yeah, but sort of we'll postpone the sort of Ukraine doesn't have to cede territory, it just doesn't have to recognize it, and then we'll build Ukraine into a modern sort of into European version of West Germany and South Korea, and then sort of people in Donbass will decide on their own where to go. Well, first of all, Koreans are not united yet. The second thing is that was already the plan during Minsk, and it didn't take into account that Russia might have a military say in the whole affair. The third thing, it might be impossible to do because the perception in Ukraine is not the same as in West Germany in the 50s, where people had trust in the military alliance of NATO, in American presence, including nuclear weapons on German soil, and hence were willing to invest in West Germany as their future, which, again, going back to what I said before, will not be the same in Ukraine if it's left alone. And third, the German model or the Korean model implies that there will be a North Korea or East Germany. And as brutal and shitty life is under North Korean rule, or as miserable as it was under East German rule, it was still Germany. It is still Korea. The occupied part of Ukraine will not be Eastern Ukraine. They will be Russia, because Russia is erasing Ukrainian language, families, civilians. They're willingly recruiting and mobilizing men into their armed forces, not because they need soldiers. Yes, they need soldiers, but first and foremost to extract the males and kill them in the war, because it opens up families for remarriage with Russian blood. They have a settler colonialism there. They invite people they deem secure from the security apparatus. They give them flats. They give them pieces of land, at least in the areas they regard secure, like Crimea, Mariupol, Donetsk, etc. And that there will not be an East Germany to reunite with. That is gone then. Absolutely gone. That will be Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad was German until 1945. I don't think it is real German right now, and that's what's going to happen. But people don't see it. People don't. They don't have friends in Mariupol who report what is happening to them. They just don't care. So all these analogies for the Cold War, for that would support the freeze, that have supported the idea of the Minsk ceasefire, are completely invalid, but people still believe in them, and I think it's a strategy while it is not.
But in that case, what model can be valid? Let me continue this question. For example, now it is very interesting situation. At the beginning of this full big invasion, some our Western partners say that it is impossible to Russia to lose very quick. But now, what we heard that the leaders of different European countries say that we must be ready for the war with Russia. But in that case, the main question is, why don't want to support Ukraine as much as possible and prevent this big war with Russia? Why? What's happened? It's not understandable.
That is a very good question, to which I have no clear answer to. Again, I try again to put myself into the shoes of people here who are not used to the way Russia thinks. They exactly those people who pose themselves as Russlandversteher, so understanders of Russia, they really don't understand it. They don't understand the mentality, the political culture. How can I frame it? They believe that every sane person will choose a peaceful path over war. But Russia does not choose a peaceful path over war. Russia chooses the path it thinks is the quickest and best way to achieve its imperial goals. If it is war, so be it. And if Russia has a competitive advantage against the West in the military field, it will use the competitive advantage in the military field to harness it against the West. Russia cannot outmatch us in pop culture or in appeal or in finance, it won't. They know they won't. But of course, there is still a chance that Russia will defeat us militarily. And that is the competitive advantage they have. They know they sometimes grossly overestimate, but that is making the whole affair even more dangerous, because if they would actually knew that they're not as good as they think they were, they wouldn't have started wars they can't win, or they can't win properly, or they can't win just after years and years and years. The second thing is, of course, there's a sense of security because of the bad Russian performance at the beginning of the war, where people say, look at these idiots. They can't even conquer Ukraine, which is not the biggest and brightest army on the planet. And we are NATO. We spend X amount of money on defense. We are much tougher and better and brighter militarily than Ukraine. So what should happen to us? But that, of course, is another very short-sighted opinion, because it is, of course, true for the short and medium term. But the European strength rests on American presence in Europe. The European strength militarily rests on the disposition of the US defense industrial apparatus to supply us with ammunition and goods in need if the need arises. Because without the Americans, we would, of course, have 1 week where we gloriously beat the Russian army, and then we run out of ammunition, and then it's over. And you don't decide a war in 1 week. They usually last longer. The problem is, of course, what happens if somewhere in the 2030s or 2040s, when the Chinese are on par with US military, the confrontation in the Asia-Pacific is then not confined to fishing boats and coastal vessels when the military is then slug it out. If the US military and defense apparatus needs to be geared up to supply major Asian allies in a great Pacific war, if they have to supply all the artillery shells to Australia, to Japan, to South Korea, to the Philippines to keep them open, if they have to stretch their Air Force, which is a huge competitive advantage over the Russian military, that the US Air Force is big, is mighty, is technologically advanced. When this huge Air Force, as huge as it is by European comparison, will be stretched out in the Pacific, then the vacuum is there for Russia to make us repay the bill, and they will seek it. And whether they will be able to seek that or not depends to a large extent on the outcome of this war, and whether military glory is still part of Russian immediate political culture, or whether they will start to concentrate on other things they might improve in their country. And yeah, in this sense, I absolutely do not understand the European reluctance. I do absolutely not understand the European unpreparedness for this. I do absolutely not understand why we did not make plans, contingency plans, if Trump is elected, or if any other American president, I'm not letting Biden off the hook here, would start to force Ukraine into an adverse ceasefire for the sake of domestic purposes, election campaign or financial squabbles or whatever they may be. We should be prepared for that. There is no excuse. The costs, if we are not prepared, that will come out of unpreparedness are so staggeringly high that even the modest increase of defense spending and supply to Ukraine greatly outweighed the negative consequences if we don't do so. Even with the highest interest rate on the planet applied to these costs, they will never be in an adverse relationship to the possible costs of, again, general Russian-European war over the continent.
Mr. Gressel, let's speak a little more about NATO, because in one of your interviews, you say that you think that scenario when Putin attack, for example, Baltic countries is possible. It means that Putin could attack NATO country. Does NATO right now is ready for this attack? I say about money, about weapons, about military Schengen as well. We know about that. And you know that all decision in NATO makes through the consensus. is it strengthening or make NATO more weak in this situation? What I mean, that, for example, one country decided, no, we don't want to do this. Everything will stop.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very important question as well.
So first, I think there is a misperception how Article 5 is implemented. Article 5 is an obligation to assist any country that is attacked and that is calling for assistance with the means that one country thinks are appropriate. And that has a lot of consequences that can go bad and can go right. First of all, it doesn't matter if other countries do not support the attacked countries in NATO, because it's a kind of, it's like a hub and spoke in a wheel. There is the country that is attacked, and NATO says to all the other countries, you need to support that country. Now, there are countries like Iceland that don't have a military. They have a coast guard, but they don't have a military. And that country of Iceland will certainly not send any troops to any attacked countries, for example, in the Baltic, because they don't have anyone. But that doesn't matter, because once a Baltic country is attacked and asks others for help, they're obliged to do so. And if Hungary stays out, they might stay out, or they might just send a postcard, or a declaration like Iceland will do. But that will not relieve or hinder any other country to do its duty under the contract. On this, the beauty of NATO is, of course, that each and every security, maybe for the exception of the United States, depends on other countries fulfilling Article 5. So there might be a reservation in Spain that Spanish interests aren't really at stake in the Baltics. But, well, Spanish interests vis-a-vis Morocco's claims would be much harder to defend if the United States would not stay behind them. And that, of course, all depends on Article 5. So they have their own national interest in having not NATO Article 5 maintained, regardless where they are. So NATO in that would kind of work more efficiently than it is usually assumed. With a big but. What if an American president declares that maintaining Article 5 as a staunch commitment is not in the American interest, neither financially nor military? Then, of course, it would provide the opening for Russia to test the ground, and the interest of all other European states and their self-confidence of actually being capable of keeping up Article 5 rests on the American commitment. So if a US president decides, we're not going to do that, or we might not going to do that, then, of course, the invitation is there for Russia to try out. And they will, of course, not try out by, I don't know, riding into Finland or staging an amphibious assault on Alaska. They will, of course, try the weakest part of NATO, where reaction times for NATO to defend itself are long, where they would have a good chance to grab territory and then kind of prepare defensive positions and say, well, now, are you going to negotiate with us? Or say, well, now, you see the Americans are not coming to your assistance. Now, here is a European security treaty, and either accept that or that will continue. Have this kind of leverage. And on these circumstances, of course, an attack on NATO is possible. Now, on the preparedness, is NATO or are the Europeans by themselves without the Americans prepared to face off the Russians? No. Are the Russians currently prepared to face off against NATO, even against the Europeans? No, because they're fighting in Ukraine. As long as the war here goes on, they are not capable of doing anything against NATO. If they would lose the war, they might for a very long time or for a considerable amount of time not be capable of doing anything against NATO. If they, of course, win the war, they might be strengthened in their belief that European or Western security guarantees are just shenanigans, that if the costs rise too high and if you insert the sufficient amount of domestic problems and squabbles into their systems, they will give up on allies, as they did in Afghanistan. And we might try that same thing with some other allies. And as we did erode their confidence in external allies and kind of turn some of them in Africa, in Afghanistan. Now let's try the same thing in Europe. We did that with a non-aligned country like Ukraine. There are few other non-aligned countries out there for grab, but then the next contest will, of course, be about NATO. And then, of course, we are not talking about tomorrow, but we are talking about the immediate, sort of intermediate future on the European continent. And then, of course, it will be tough because the next test then is on us, and it will certainly not be at a point in time where we are the strongest. Remember, they started in February 2022 with Europe coming out of the pandemic. And the pandemic and pandemic response and all anti-vaccination squabbles inside Europe and the United States with a sizable anti-vaxxer movement was a huge success for Russian propaganda. And they very probably deeply overestimated the division in Europe. They also deeply overestimated their capability of doing that same thing again in the case of a Russian-Ukrainian full-scale invasion. And hence, we should not think that just because we spend more nominally in defense and we have more modern tanks, we will automatically be secure. Russia is prone to do a lot of stupid things.
You say, very interesting, if Russia lose, if Russia win. But do you think that there is a clear, understandable, what does it mean? Russia lose or Russia win? And what is the line between this lose or win for our Western partners?
Well, I think I should first outline what winning and losing would mean. For Russia to win means to erase Ukraine as a country and nation. And that does not only imply military presence, at least in most of the country, even if they would sort of force a ceasefire on their terms that would sort of make a puppet government somewhere in Western Ukraine. I don't think that puppet government would be accepted, and the turmoil thereafter would be used by the Russians to have a pretext to invade the rest. Then you have a Russia that is not only a successful colonial power, but you also have a Russia that has committed most of its armed forces and domestic security forces, because then you have Volosgadia, you have FSB, etc., pounding into the occupied areas, which then will be all of Ukraine, into a genocide. And they will personally rationalize what they have done there by the myth that the West is an evil empire and tries to destroy Russia and Ukraine is just a Western project, because this is the excuse upon they have done the most hideous atrocities. And this is something you can learn from German history, even if the lies of the regime are horrendously stupid and for everybody to see as complete and bogus lie. People will rationalize them and support them as long as it supports and eases their moral burden on their personal life choices. Then you will have a Russia where a settler movement in Ukraine will be a sizable part of the political apparatus. And I'm not talking about elections and democracy, because Russia is no democracy and elections don't matter. But you will have people loyal to the security apparatus who settle in Ukraine, and the genocide that has happened there before is the cause of existence for their wealth and property. And they will keep and defend it. They will hedge against any domestic Russian change that might jeopardize this. So we'll have this kind of militaristic KGB-led autocracy that is hostile to the West and inherently aggressive and colonial. That will be carved in stone. There is no other way to depart from that other than a major Russian civil war, which I would not see at that point, because they are firmly in their saddle. And of course, all the escalation scenarios I talked before will become even more likely with this kind of domestic setup in Russia, with this kind of domestic interest in Russia, and with this kind of Russian society. What would mean a defeat? That's a far more blurry thing. Ukraine says 1991 borders. True, but it would also matter quite a lot how the 1991 borders would be reached. It would be an outcome of the war where it is militarily clear that Russia not only was incapable of conquering Ukraine, also where Russian military adventurism failed, and the failures of the Russian army and its weaknesses are inseparable to the Russian regime. And where this kind of defeat, the complete inability to reach its goal, even at horrendous costs, cause a Russian rethink of how their state is run and what it is about. That is, of course, fuzzy, and it requires a lot of military effort for Ukraine, but it's, of course, achievable. Now, how about things in the middle? Well, everything in the middle would represent a mixture of these two extremes. The more, of course, Russia wins, compared to at least February 23rd, the more the war camp feels vindicated and entrenched, and the more we will tilt towards the scenario that is described as Russian victory. The second thing is, of course, the issue of future security order / Ukraine's security arrangements. People talk about Israel's solution when they talk about a ceasefire, and I think that's absolutely idiotic. First of all, Israel is a nuclear power. Second of all, before being an established nuclear power and not being attacked conventionally, there have been 5 attempts to erase Israel by conventional military means, like not terrorism, not missile attacks, but sending the army across the border. And the last big attempt, of course, in the Yom Kippur War ended with Israeli forces 39 kilometers before Damascus, the Syrian capital, and on the western bank of the not only of the Sinai Channel, but of the Sinai as such, and kind of on the way to Cairo. Now, of course, that gave Arab leaders the way, like, okay, we're not going to decide this militarily. And they took their lesson since. And those who didn't want to take the lesson resorted to terrorism, but, you know, the conventional Arab states declined to attack Israel over. Now, that would mean, if you would imply a Israel solution, that the Ukrainians would come close to Moscow with their army, or kind of completely defeat the Russian army and encircle them on the Kuban and kind of cause a total collapse of the military machine. I don't see that happening, at least with the military supplies they're getting now. So I think this kind of Israel solution scenarios are pure nonsense. If we have an intermediate scenario, as I said before, we'll have a very tense situation in Ukraine. We will have the expectation of further hostilities or further full-scale invasion, and you will have a country that is in utter fear constantly about that, and that either receives the military alliance and military support to be prepared for that, or that gradually succumbs to fear and uncertainty and kind of ruins from the inside, and then maybe get another Russian war once they feel equipped to open up the chapter again.
If you have maybe next couple of minutes, I have a last question, if it is possible. Yeah. If you say about the Israel, I just remember my big interview with Israeli military expert David Gendelman, and we speak about the modern conventional war. And he explained that even in Israel, they now try to rethink what army must be in future, how it must looks like. For example, at the very beginning, the best model was, you know, small army with high technology. But now, what we see that Russia, that Iran, this North Korea use their not modern and not high technology weapons, and they have some success. And in that case, do you think that next period, it will be the period of preparing for this big conventional war, and it will be no step back in production of weapons, and everything could change, and this big conventional war could be the next challenge for Europe, for the world?
Well, I think in military history, there's a kind of oscillation between colonial wars, if I may say so, and mass wars and great power wars. And you have times where military apparatuses incline towards colonial adventures or out of territory spoils. And in that case, usually quality matters over quantity, because these endeavored are sort of the existence of society is not at stake. Whether you fail or not fail in Iraq, the existence of the American society is not at stake by that. You have very narrow political goals, and you want to achieve them with the minimum of costs. So you focus on quality. You also have no totalitarian goals towards the other side. Americans didn't try to erase Iraqis when they came in 2003. They wanted to change the political order. So you have very narrow, small political goals, very far away, and you go into quality. The same was, for example, in the interwar period. World War I seemed to have settled all the big power conflicts, and, for example, the Italian army purchased a lot of light, or the British army as well, a lot of light tanks, small troops. The British went fully professional, because that was what was needed to police the British Empire. And you don't need mass. Mass would only complicate things, because mass does something wrong, and then you have bad newspaper articles where some conscript shot somebody, etc. You don't want that. And you can, of course, afford to be good qualitatively, because you can pour a lot of money into very few systems. Of course, the thing then turns around once you are engaging in a full war where the existence of your own society is at stake, because that mobilizes more resources within your own society. You suddenly start to feel like you're being in a total war. All of society feels affected by what is happening and wants to contribute. You have an enemy that really wants to change the political and societal order in a way that you think, no, I'd rather die than endure this. And that is, of course, then pitching the whole conflict towards mass, because suddenly you have society mobilized, economies mobilized, and you're confronted with the need to not so much qualitatively improve, but quantitatively outmatch the other. And this is what we're seeing now, for example, in Ukraine, for example, with drones. I mean, drones, if you compare them to high precision, state-of-the-art Western standoff weapons, of course, drones are less effective and they're less lethal, but you could never employ these high-tech weapons in the quantity that drones are employed in Ukraine in a short amount of time to increase your lethality with your force, because the quantity is completely lacking. And so, of course, for the contingent of, for example, a large war in the Pacific, but China kind of claims the first and second island belt, okay, your colonies now, and we go. Such an event would immediately tilt towards mass warfare, because the Chinese would mobilize the huge economic advantage in the civilian sector and try to leverage it against the Americans. That would imply a lot of drones, a lot of, for example, the Chinese build a lot of civilian yachts. You can use this industry to build naval drones, etc. And the Americans would immediately be confronted with not necessarily the most sophisticated attack means, also sophisticated, but not exclusively. They would be confronted with a huge quantity of low cost but effective means of attack. And they would then, of course, preclude you deal with that with the most sort of sophisticated high-tech super-duper weapon, because you could never produce the most high-tech super-duper whatever weapon in the quantity to guard, for example, all logistical hubs and harbors against surface water drone attacks by the Chinese in the whole Asian Pacific theater. It's impossible. So Americans then would, of course, extremely quickly have to reorganize themselves around quantity, abandoning some of the ideas around quality. And yeah, I think the Russian-Ukrainian war, in terms of how to fight it, how to finance it, gives us some clues in what to be expected. Of course, a war in the Pacific would look substantially different than the continental war we're facing now. But for Europeans, what they would face with Russia or with other revisionist powers will exactly be a replica of what Ukraine faces now. And we should take lesson of it. But yeah, as I said, the mindset in Europe often is that any power that benefits from peace will choose a peaceful path, which is not the case. And it's not only Russia. There are other powers as well that will choose war if war pays out, or they think that war will pay out for them.
Mr. Gressel, thank you so much for being our guest today. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.